Hello, and today I'm with Bradley Tuck of Exploding Appendix, the founder and primary editor of the journal, zine, podcast, collective, etc.
Yeah, it's a lot of things.
Yeah, like your mission statement, it's a little bit hard to pin down. I have followed you for about 4 years. I think the project's a little older than that. You profiled me way back when you were doing a series of thinker profiles, and particularly you were interested in people who operated in both politics and art. Um, it's very interesting to me because very few people talk to me about the intersection of those worlds, and so I started following your work from there. Um, Recently, you've actually interviewed a whole lot of people in my sphere. You've interviewed my best friend, Shalom Bentine. You've interviewed Doug Green, who I'm not as close to, but I have personally championed a lot of his more recent work. You've interviewed my old editor in front of me, Doug Lane. Um, so there's a lot of overlap there. But one of the things that I think would surprise people about Exploiting Appendix is that you hear those names, you associate them primarily with, frankly, American and frankly Marxist cultural theory, critical theory, history. And the mission of the magazine is actually much broader than that. It's much more fragmented. I mean, deliberately so, right?
Yes, yeah. I think it is a very.
Good.
No, carry on.
No, I was just a
Okay.
tick.
I mean, I think I suppose I just generally find myself kind of interested in a lot of different things, but I suppose I'm constantly drawn back to the relationship between sort of avant-garde art and sort of radical politics of some kind. So those are sort of themes that I kind of go between. But because I was kind of always interested in a sort of broad array of topics, I was very keen to build that into the project rather than sort of see it as simply about one specific thing. So, and also partly so I can get other people involved and sort of collaborate with people and have other perspectives, sort of allow for that sort of fragmentation to sort of help me build something really.
So I've always been interested in projects that do that. Like when I think about in the past things that I've tried to do that, and something that kind of rhymes with you, but with a very different political skewing was like Feral House Press, in the States, which was also interested in like high art culture, low culture, politics, though its politics skewed weird and slightly right, and yours does not. But also was very interested in like Bauhaus culture, Weimar culture, queer culture in general. So there is a kind of overlap there. Also, if you go through your archives, as we were talking about off air, Exploding Appendix includes the archives of 1+1, where you devoted a lot of space to queer artists like Derick Jarman, who are also equally hard to pin down. Like if you try to parse out, the film Jubilee with the film Wittgenstein, there's a relationship there, but it is far from immediately obvious. So what are your major artistic influences going into this project, and how have they influenced the project?
Interesting. So I certainly think if you're thinking about something like Jarman, I think certainly that influenced a lot of. He certainly influenced a lot of the people around sort of 1+1. I suppose also like the Kuchar brothers actually influenced a lot of 1+1, and people. Some of those different people. I think 1+1 was very much a kind of combination of sort of underground sort of cinema and sort of more art house kind of cinema. I mean, I also sort of wrote about things like Mary Poppins, so it wasn't completely art house cinema, but I suppose there was an element of critical theory going on there as well, and sort of thinking about sort of cinema in a much broader sense. I suppose I also take a lot of influence from sort of people like Lynch, David Lynch, and I like, I suppose, if you're talking about my actual work, I suppose there's elements of that sort of the attempt to try and subvert the melodrama. So I quite like a lot of people like Cirque through Fassbinder. I think Almodovar does some bits of like attempting to sort of play with the melodrama.
Mm-hmm.
I would also say I think there's also these moments, kind of intense moments, which I think actually goes from even from the aesthetic of like exploring an exploding appendix. I think I have an understanding of what that actually means, but it's an intense kind of, it refers to at some level a kind of intense kind of experience. And I'm kind of quite interested in creating, I think I constantly come back to these kind of really sort of moments of quite intensity. And I think like, I'm assuming we'll get into the Cake Tasting Society or some of my other projects later, but like there are moments in that which I think sort of escalate to this kind of point of some kind of intensity.
I think that's interesting to me because when I looked at your larger project, actually, when you first, this is going to seem a little bit arcane to people who don't know either one of us, but you messaged me kind of semi out of the blue asking for a profile about my art and my politics, and I kind of pushed back on you because I was like, there is not really any relation at all. As opposed to like, say, Douglas Lane, who views his science fiction project almost explicitly as part of his political project. But what I find interesting is I think we share an interest in fragmentation, intensity of experience, the aesthetics of what would be conventionally considered not ugly entirely, but almost grotesque. There are a few other artists that I know that mostly poets, because that's my field, who work in a similar vein. Here in America, Dylan Krieger, it's kind of a friend of mine. Friends maybe a strong word, but we have endorsed each other's books. It has a similar relationship with ideas and the body and the way the two things break down and explode. Now, what I think is interesting about the podcast and the interview element of what you do is that's like in the background, and it's almost more manifested in like the wide variety of stuff you cover than any like particular interview, right? Like, does that make sense? Like, there's a way in which there's an all-encompassingness to it, that's just going all over the place, and it kind of fits in with that aesthetic.
I think it just cut out a little bit, so I didn't quite hear the full of that.
Oh, I just said I don't
all of that. I think some of it cut out a little bit for me.
Okay, no problem. So what I was saying is that if I was to look at any particular interview on your site, particularly in your podcast, I would not necessarily see that aesthetic commitment all the time. But if I look at it as a whole, that kind of explosiveness and that interest in like intensity, contrast, the contrast of intensity is very much like running through everything as far as like the broadness of what you're selecting. Like, if we just go to the front page of right now, we go to the main feed of Exploding Appendix, right? And then we have, let's see, Marxism and Cultural Revolution, The Body in Fukushima, Haunted Bajas, How to Write a Manifesto, like Ho Chi Minh, like Che Guevara, Revolutionary Left in Ethiopia. And so, not like, some of those things that directly relate to that, like Exploding Appendix mission. Some of the things seem to be tangential, but taken as a whole, that broadness is definitely there. And that intensity is definitely there.
Yeah.
So, what has really surprised you in the course of going, building this project, building this publication?
What has surprised me? I think, I mean, I'm not sure if there's a strictly, I'm not sure if there's a strict surprise that's ever, I suppose what I'm just constantly, if there is a surprise, it's the sort of fact that just things keep evolving and changing as things go on, really. But things do sort of manage to be sort of achieved. So I guess it's more of a story, I guess, than simply there being one thing that's actually sort of surprised me. It's more this sort of accumulation of stuff that sort of happened. I mean, it's always, I mean, running any of these kind of projects, there's always like tough moments, and then there's sort of more enjoyable moments. But yeah, I'm not sure if there's I can't think of a particular thing that surprised me off the top of my head.
Okay. What are the relationships do you see between the politics that you cover and the art that you cover?
Well, maybe would it be helpful for me to sort of define how I understand the word exploding appendix? Because that might help. So, I mean, partly I see it as a metaphor for the back pages of a book. So the appendix as being the sort of fragmented section of a book, and you can sort of imagine them growing to the point where the actual core of the book, or the main thesis of the book is missing, and so all you've got is this kind of expanding kind of appendix. So on the one hand, I think there's an element of like this fragmented thing, but without the main core of the text. But I like also I like the parallels between the notion of an appendix and an encyclopedia. So I like this idea that it could potentially be growing to the point where it becomes an encyclopedia. So on the one hand, I sort of see, if you look back at the history of the encyclopedia, we're talking like people like Diderot, but maybe also people like Bogdanov. The encyclopedia is a way of sort of creating an all-encompassing kind of system of thought, which would define a new particular revolutionary period. So you could sort of see, in one way, you could interpret, say, Diderot as sort of being a precursor to the French Revolution. And you can sort of see Bogdanov in relation to the Russian Revolution, sort of trying to think about how a new form of encyclopedia might kind of define a new era. But then you can also think about how, in terms of like modernist text, you get this kind of either disruption of conventional narratives or disruption of genres and forms. So this idea of the appendix without a core also seems to resonate with that kind of sort of avant-gardism, or that wing of avant-gardism. So I see it in some ways as drawing upon both of those kind of traditions, I guess. But that would be my sort of intellectualization of some of those ideas.
Oh, okay. So in many ways, this is sort of a decentered encyclopedic project where you're sort of spiraling around new ideas that are emerging in philosophy and art. But it's also kind of ephemeral in that way too.
Yeah.
As you were talking, I'm surprised you didn't mention Benjamin's The Arcades projects, because it also reminds me of that a little bit.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is vital right now? I find it interesting because I think most trends in media are actually going in the other direction, despite the fact we have this hyper decentered media that's like cancerously spreading in all kinds of crazy places. That it's also primarily surviving off of marketing to very specific niches, and your project by definition cannot do that.
Yeah, I mean, it struggles to do that. But and I think maybe that's one of the things I'm sort of drawn to. One of the things I see sort of missing sometimes is that attempt to try and bring these different thoughts together, or take insights from slightly different places, because I think there are lots of it's easy to, it's really useful, I think, to actually take to sort of critically engage with a range of different perspectives. And there's a lot of perspectives that I think have insight. Sometimes they might be flawed, but there's some insight within that I want to be able to sort of draw upon. And I think being able to sort of go between traditions to some extent is really useful. At least I find that a really useful way of sort of, it doesn't mean that I don't have some sort of broader agenda, but I suppose I'm trying to explore that broader agenda through different traditions, different approaches.
I see. So what would you see the relationship of this project to, say, the political left? Why is that? Why are the two things in any way tied together?
Well, I suppose it might be just partly because I generally see myself as being on the political left, but I do see it as a kind of emancipatory project. I mean, you could imagine a lot of the things I've said could be completely taken out of that context. So that, I mean, I don't think avant-garde art necessarily leads to radical politics. I don't even think, a lot of things that we sort of think of as radical theory necessarily leads to radical politics. But I suppose there's an attempt within my work to sort of draw those things together, or sort of draw upon them. It is to some extent because I am trying to I do sort of want to draw upon different traditions in order to imagine an emancipatory future of some kind, and to help us think about how we might, bring that about. So I suppose there is that going on in my work, and the ways in which, as a sort of social project, we can bring people together and sort of exchange ideas and give support and all those kind of things that you would need in the project of building towards something.
So I think that is an. I think actually just like the fact that it's a personal affiliation is usually probably good enough. But I do think there's often a tension between avant-garde art and left-wing politics, and particularly in the way it is presented. I mean, historically speaking, yes, a lot of the avant-garde movements, let's say the early modernist movement in the early 20th century, were left affiliated, but by mid to high modernism, that actually wasn't really true, and the artistic movements were actually more likely to be, frankly, proto-fascist. And then by late modernism, in America at least, and that's the artistic and literary tradition I know, you see depoliticization, like confessional poetry, Charles Olson and stuff like that. Yeah. Are you familiar with Grail Marcus's Lipstick Traces?
Yes, but I haven't read it.
Okay.
I am familiar with it. Familiar in the sense that I've probably picked up, read bits of it, but not ever kind of gone through the whole thing.
Right. I find it interesting because of the basic argument of that book is that the political schism in early modernist art, like Dada and Surrealism, etc., doesn't get manifested so much in modernist art later. It gets manifested in its pop culture variation, which comes about a generation and a half later, which is 70s. He thinks 70s punk rock aesthetic has a direct line to that early modernist stuff. Partly because of obsessions with low culture, partly because of the DIY kind of absurdist aesthetic, but partly directly. And also he thinks the weird political schismium of like, well, if you hang out with punk bands are as likely to be anarchist or fascist as anything else. He doesn't actually explain why that kind of artistic movement does that, but he does think it's essential to the movement and just kind of traces it out and traces the way that they rhyme with each other and the direct and indirect influences. And so when I think about the kind of art that you're engaging in, I do think that there is a way in which, like, you have Jarman. I think Jarman very much was a leftist. But you have someone like Jodorowsky, who is not a rightist per se, but is definitely not a left-winger. Like, And I think it's interesting because one of the things I think comes out of that kind of aesthetic, and it even shows up a little bit in your own interviews and whatnot, is that there tends to be, high aesthetic tends to overlap with the occult. Now, I tend to take like Adorno's view of that's actually like the aesthetic kind of degrading into something else. But have you seen, I mean, this is kind of a wild question, but have you noticed that in the milieu you work with and the artists you work with and stuff like that? Like the
Oh yeah, you definitely get an occult interest. I mean, I think we did it when it was 1+1, not when we did a whole issue on the. Well, it wasn't just the occult; it was about like all those kind of the horror and evil. I think a broader array, so it wasn't just occultism. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely. I actually think there's an interest in the occult. I mean, yeah, I think there are sort of different groups in the UK, for example, I think that sort of explore sort of the occult as a kind of avant-garde theme. I mean, even, some of the people that, I mean, we did a podcast with James Riley a while back. Oh, we didn't do a podcast, but I need to turn it into a podcast. But we did a session with him a while back on Charles Manson and about how he sort of emerges out of the sort of 60s and how the sort of 60s go into sort of a dark direction, which is sort of, and is a sort of, it's not particularly, I mean, you could say there are sort of some there's a radical turn that sort of happens in politics, but it's much more violent in the 70s, which seems to be, the Baader-Meinhof style stuff. So he sort of goes into some of that, but I suppose in terms of left-wing politics, a lot of that doesn't seem particularly left-wing. And of course, even like someone like Ayn Rand, who, if you think about something like The Fountainhead, it's a lot about avant-garde architecture, but it's not at all radical politics. So I personally wouldn't say that any of this necessarily leads to good politics or positive politics. I mean, but I would say I also wouldn't want to abandon it. I think there's, I mean, maybe it's just because at some level, I think it's quite useful for sort of imagining something else at some level. Partly because I think it's quite good to have a politics which isn't just sort of didactic in a purely didactic. It's sort of trying to inspire people, seduce people in a certain sense, to try and think about to bring them over to a particular kind of politics. So I suppose I would want something, and sometimes I have some sort of idea, but I can never articulate it particularly in words, or if they are in words, they're not necessarily, if it is words, it's not necessarily words that you could write in an academic kind of way.
Right.
So there's certain times where I'm sort of trying to sort of explore something that I don't always know what it is. So yeah, there's a sort of range of reasons why something like avant-garde art or counterculture might be useful, because it kind of allows us to sort of approach things in a slightly different way, which can free things up. But yeah, I don't think that that's necessarily going to translate into a positive political movement. In fact, with anything, but then I think this is also quite an important point, right? Which is, it's important to also understand that everything that we can appeal to could potentially go in a really dark direction. So even if it's sort of a really good theory, it can be applied in a really terrible way. And there's ways in which, we should be sort of almost hypercritical of what we're doing, not in the sense that we're being really negative on what we're doing, but in the sense that we're aware of the limits of or the ways that things can be kind of misapplied, or all those kind of things, really.
Yeah, well, I think that's a very interesting point, and one that I think a lot about, because my own aesthetics are closer to yours poetically. They're also like, if I look down and like am really honest about like who the biggest aesthetic influencers are on me, there are a lot of queer and women artists, and then frankly there are a lot of fascists. Like, I'm just gonna be like, Ezra Pound is super important to me. And I'm completely aware of the political problems of that. I think about filmmakers. A lot of the better filmmakers are not left-wing filmmakers, and a lot of the better poets, left poets tend to not really be leftist. Like, as a side note, they tend to act. I mean, I know everybody says, this person's a liberal, but they do actually tend to be some kind of like very radical liberal. They're very invested tentatively in whatever, like Labor, our Democratic Party, our Liberal Party in Canada. They tend to be very resonant with that. That's new, since the beginning of the MFA. And while I think a lot of people way overstate the MFA CIA OSS, actually it's pre-CIA OSS story. The OSS did help fund the IRA workshop. They were trying to break up writers' movements in cities and get them more in the academy. That's true. They were also funding people who were protesting these very movements and artists, and they were doing all kinds of wild stuff. It wasn't like they had really thought out this whole depoliticization program in a very like specific way in which the MFA was designed to completely destroy the artistic movements in the United States. But there is a sense in which left liberalism is the dominant background politics of a lot of artists in the academy, because it's the dominant politics of the academy. And film is kind of an exception to that, because film has it is actually somewhat economic, that it has a large enough carrying capacity that you can have obscure films that really don't come out of state patronage, but also, and I'm not, there's some good films that come out of state patronage, like particularly the Canadian film industry. I mean, we wouldn't have Cronenberg, for example, without that. But in the States, so you have that there. But in the US, what you've seen is a kind of narrowing of politics and an expansion of identities related to that politics in my field. And then there's a reaction to that. Most of that reaction, however, does tend to be somewhat right-wing over time. And so what I've been interested in is I've also been interested in the reincorporation of like left-wing art that is not as tied to MFAs over here in the States, to formal, lit and art departments, etc. And in one way, we live in a great time for that. I mean, Patreon makes it a lot easier. And then in another way, we live in a terrible time for that. Patreon makes it a lot easier, but distribution channels are also a lot more glutted. So, how's your project really handled that? Like that, particularly a project like yours, which has such a broad identity.
Well, I often struggle because there is a challenge of trying to attract. Partly I do it locally as well. So I run. Before the lockdown, it was a little bit more local. So we would run these sessions in the pub. And I'm trying to get back to doing sort of a hybrid where people can join online, but we can also have a sort of like a pub setting or like a bar setting. So there was that sort of way of doing it. But yeah, a lot of the time, it is challenging. I've been, I suppose it's a kind of small project in a way. It's mainly run by me, but there are other people sort of generally involved. And there are sort of challenges, I think, in terms of just getting it out to people. And it's getting the work that we're doing out into the world is kind of quite a challenging thing in some respects.
So this is a good place to pivot about your other project that's related to Exploding Appendix. I think it's the Cake Eaters or Cake Tasters Society.
The Cake Tasting Society, yeah.
Cake Tasting Society, which you shared an upcoming highly imagistic film with me, and it's something that you do have to watch. So when it's available to the public, people should watch it. But it is very much an imagist film. It's a lot, it's a lot more surreal. If people are looking for a narrative, there probably is one there, maybe, but it's not immediately apparent. Um, I find this interesting, but before we get into it like too deeply right now, because I feel like the turn in left wing art in general for the last, say, 5 to 10 years is towards like explicitly didactic art, like quasi-socialist realism in movie form. I mean, even though they wouldn't call it socialist realism, but it's very much like, slice of real life, or or left-wing interpretations of popular cinema, which I like to call the Jacobin. This movie is great, but it would be better if it was socialist school of criticism. And I think your film totally eschews that. Like you couldn't do that with that. What about that really interests you? And do you think there's any political content in the film at all?
Well, so I suppose if I go back to why that film came about, which was, I think that year, so this was 2018. I think I was doing some kind of political podcasts, but there were a few. And I was also interviewing a couple of artists throughout that year. Well, Daniel and Clara, who are filmmakers themselves. So I was doing a year-long interview with them. And so some of the discussions that I did with them sort of fed into this. But partway through the year, they invited me out to Portugal, because that's where they were at the time, to make a film. And in 3 days, I think I was out there for 3 or 4 days. And about 3 of those, they shot a feature film. It's called Plot Points, which is not out yet. But at some point, I don't know when it will be out, but it will be out at some point in the future. But I was so impressed at the fact that they managed to shoot something like a feature film, within 3 days, that I kind of felt very inspired. And I came back trying to think what I could do within a short period of time to make a film. So I suppose, in a way, I wouldn't say I didn't necessarily think about how that would have been. I suppose politics wasn't the main thing on my mind, but I was kind of, in some respects, kind of surprised that I didn't make a political film as my first film. It's a theme that I come back to, but part of the reason it didn't become a political film was because I wanted to take dialogue and discussion and words out of the film mainly. Partly because that made it easier to shoot, so you don't have to worry about people getting their lines right and all those kind of things, or having a particular script. So incidentally, I'm working on a project. I don't know how long it will take me to finish, but I'm working on a project called Disrupted Rhythms. And there's an essay version of some of that project online, but that's more about, on the one hand, getting people to kind of meet together and just do dancing. And they're not necessarily professional dancers, but then also thinking about the nature of rhythm and about the political nature of rhythm. So I've been reading a lot of Henri Lefebvre and people like that in order to think about sort of rhythm from, everything from like the body and its different organs right through to political systems and revolutions and things like the COVID outbreak and how rhythms change. So that project I do think is political in a way, but it's also trying to integrate a lot of these kind of more physical image-based stuff as well. So I would say that is a sort of attempt at some kind of synthesis between those two different things. This one, I suppose, if it's political, it's more my subconscious politics. It's the ideas and themes that kind of come out. If I was doing a political film, more overtly political film, I think these things might be there, but they'd be thought about in a different way. So I suppose, yeah. So if there is a politics of this film, it's one that I don't necessarily understand completely. It's more of a kind of subconscious politics, I guess.
Do you feel like this film also comes out of the pandemic in a particular way? I mean, we haven't actually spoke about that, but it does seem to be informing everything we do lately. It definitely informs my art.
Yeah. Oh, so the Cake Tasting Society was made shot in 2018. So I
Oh,
wouldn't
so
say
it comes before. Okay.
yeah. So whereas Disrupted Rhythms, which is my current sort of project, I don't know how long it will take, is much more based on sort of or has coped with the outbreak because lockdowns are a form of disrupted rhythm. So I suppose that is. But also, I also imagine it referring to a revolution could be a disruptive rhythm, and I don't think it is just, or a disruptive rhythm might be you break your leg and you have to learn how to use it again or whatever, or those kind of things could be a disruptive rhythm. So it could be a broad array of different topics there, but I suppose that's more of a meditative project, but it has some sort of political underpinning. Whereas this one, I don't really understand the politics completely. I think it's
that's fair enough.
I'm interested in people having something to say about the politics of this.
I actually often find that with my artistic work, and particularly with people who don't know my politics very well, that I'm very interested in what they actually think the political content is. For the same reasons, because I do think there is a way when you're operating on a semi-subconscious or semi-conscious, it's probably a better way to phrase it, because if it's subconscious, you wouldn't know to put it down in art. But in a semi-conscious way, that there's stuff bubbling up that you don't know how it's going to be interpreted by an individual or the larger social sphere, and so trying to control its political content and its political messaging often seems to me to be like wrong-headed, and usually the only way you can really do it anyway is like interpretive gloss after the fact, which we all know is a little bit dishonest. You can't trust artists to artist statements. They probably don't know what they're doing either. I mean, I think I am one of those. I guess in this sense, I am one of those dirty Foucauldians who sometimes thinks like, well, the artist is not nearly as important as the social context for the art. That trying to have the artist set the tone for the meaning will be just as misleading as pretending that the artist had no intention whatsoever.
I try not to. Also, I try not to tell people what I think it means too much anyway, because it's within something like the Cake Tasting Society. I think it's more interesting that people try and engage with it and think about what it actually might mean themselves. And there's something really what's the word? Like there's something about sort of giving people the answers to a particular film that just sort of deprives the film of some of the magic that's in there. Disenchanting.
Yeah, I would say. Yeah, I would agree with you that it has a very disenchanting effect. I'm interested though in this other project that is percolating up. What do you think Lefebvre, in the politics of everyday life, would say about the current situation under the pandemic, where things are so disruptive and everything is changing so much, and space is changing rather radically the way we engage with space, and I don't think it's going to go away immediately once this pandemic is over either.
No, I don't. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what he'd say himself. I mean, I just found Rhythm Analysis, is that very small book by him, actually really useful to just try and think about rhythms, which can be like, I can't remember exactly, but there's a moment in the book where he talks about people doing the same routine in completely different contexts. Like everyone gets up at a particular time, but it's just because they've generally got this routine of doing it. And I think especially in a context like the pandemic, you get there are these kind of ways in which rhythms, even without knowing it, we fall into these different types of rhythms. So, I mean, obviously, there's a way of then trying to take that into sort of thinking about how we might apply that to politics. But I think there is just a sense of, I found that book quite useful to think in a very loose way about starting to think about rhythms and political rhythms of a whole range of different things.
I mean, when I think about political rhythms right now, I mean, what I find interesting is the space was kind of getting disrupted before the pandemic, if we're honest. Like like politics as normal has kind of been, I mean, the last decade has been putting a nail in that coffin, but at least in both our countries. But
well, I suppose even since like 2008 and
right.
You know, the financial, it feels at least in our countries like again that this period has been quite an upheaval.
Yeah, I would say since the financial crisis, since what I deem as the mortal wounding of neoliberalism, if I'm honest, that's I've begun to think about 2007 as like when neoliberalism has received a fatal wound, but now it's like zombieing on while this new thing's emerging, and they're both awful. So you know that's increasingly the way I conceptualize what's happened, but I do think that artistically this has been an interesting period, and what I find lately is where that artistic vitality has been as far as popular art goes, has been in kind of genre movies, particularly horror movies, I think, partly because of the way social relations and grotesquerie and all that can be more explicitly explored, and partly because frankly the streaming platforms need content, so now there's a place for those movies to go again, where they weren't being made a whole lot, you know, between like 2008 and 2015. There just weren't a lot of them, and when they were being made, they were remakes. Where else do you think you find a lot of interesting popular art that is kind of dealing with some of these themes in a kind of more raw and maybe a dreamlike way?
Popular. I mean, most of my references, I suppose, are kind of relatively art films. I mean, I suppose. What would I say? So I suppose I would think like my background in I'm not sure where I would actually see contemporary, I suppose, surrealist-like film. But I mean, because I mean, I grew up a lot with. Do you remember? I don't know if you know these kind of comedy shows in the UK, but I suppose this is early 2000s. It's going back 20 years, I guess. But you had like a lot of British sort of very dark, surreal comedy. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say it was all explicitly left politics, but things like Monkey Dust, and you sort of had a lot of Chris Morris things like Jam and Brass Eye. And then, I mean, there might be kind of
those are somewhat deep cuts for Americans, but I am actually familiar with Monkey Dust. I think probably because from that time period, 20 years ago, what was mostly coming over here would be stuff like Spaced from the UK. But yeah, the UK has a clearer, I mean, I think always has had a clearer tradition of like surrealist comedy. And I think it's actually, I mean, I could probably come up with, all kinds of speculations as to why. I mean, the US also had, for a very brief window of time, I think, actually, it seems brief now, this kind of very absurdist, surreal comedy that was popular from like 2005 to about maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and it's kind of fallen away. Very much associated with like things like Adult Swim, and that it is interesting how close that work is to art house film. The two genres that actually overlap the most with art house film, as far as popular genres, would be. I think this sincerely is horror movies. And you see a popular art house maker like David Lynch, who like often gets classified somehow as a horror movie maker, which is weird. Just because it makes you feel so off. But and then absurdist, alt in quotation marks comedy. But both those things in the U.S., the horror is kind of maintained, but the kind of absurdist comedy has not. And I couldn't even explain to you why that has happened.
Well, I think in America, I tend to, most of the time I like American comedies actually seem to be not comedies as such. Like I actually think Twin Peaks is quite interesting to be viewed. If you view Twin Peaks as a comedy, I think, and which it does have those kind of elements. It seems closer to something like a Jam or Monkey Dust or something like that.
Right.
It seems sort of more in that kind of tradition.
Yeah, I find David Lynch to be both disturbing and hilarious, but most people don't really pick up on the hilarity of it all. And I find that going all the way back to a movie. I mean, like his early films. So
like Eraserhead.
Eraserhead. I think Lost Highway and Mulholland Drive are A, the same movie, and B, kind of funny. And that you miss it because of the music and the grotesque framing. But like, if the camera angle was slightly different, you'd have been cued to read it as humor and not very dark humor, but humor, and not horror.
It just, I suppose there's there's some. I remember seeing Mulholland Drive in the cinema, and it just getting loads of laughs, which is quite an interesting kind of context. So I think I quite often think of it in terms. You can see a lot of these kind of weird bits. There's these kind of weird bits where you don't know whether you're meant to laugh or kind of sort of run screaming. And I think that goes into some of those comedy shows as well. Like I think there's those moments where they just seem, especially like the moment I don't know if you see Jam as well, like the intro
no, I haven't seen
Jam. The intro moments in Jam, I think they're online. I think you can find them on YouTube and stuff. But the intro moments are just so dark. I think the humor is just coming out of this sort of bleak comedy, really. It's hard to even say that it's comedy.
Right. I mean, I think there always is kind of almost an explicit relationship between horror and comedy because they are based off of more primal responses, more limbic responses, and a lot of it's based off timing, and then the way people tend to respond to them is primed by their context more than other things, which is say very different than say science fiction film, which is when it's not a science fiction horror is usually hyper cerebral, like and so it's those genres are somehow related. I mean, but it's been interesting because I do remember there feeling like there was this vital absurd comedy in the United States, particularly in cartoons, that seemed to have quietly faded away around the beginning of the Trump administration, and no one said a word. Like no one even noticed, and it went anywhere. I don't have a theory as to why that is. So I suppose the next question would be, since your goal, I mean, an Exploding Appendix is, is it literature, art and culture with guts? What's the tagline?
Yeah, I think it is art and culture with guts. Yeah.
Yeah, ideas and cultural guts. Okay,
Oh,
and
yeah.
what do you see as a relationship between culture, which is a oh my god nebulous term that even my
Yeah.
studies into anthropology have never clarified what the hell we
Yeah.
actually mean by it. Politics and art, because I do think, for example, like the very vulgar, super vulgar Marxist reading would be like that culture and art are like epiphenomena of ideological production. And
Mhm.
I have always actually thought, well, that might be true for pop culture and for like the culture industry, but as a phenomenon, I don't really think that's what's going on. Because it's hard to justify some kinds of avant-garde art in terms of either production or power relations. Like, it's just that doesn't make any sense. So I sort of take I do sort of kind of take an almost Bataille view that it has to do with like the kind of random bubblings up of social surplus or whatever. Um, but what do you think the relationship of all that is, and how do these ideas play off of each other, and like what is your response to the vulgar Marxist that none of this really matters anyway?
Um, so so I think at some level that I do have some sort of materialist understanding of like social change. So I don't think you can just imagine the kind of world you want to have appear and it just sort of appears through sort of saying it. There's a process in which the material economic kind of conditions of society you're in does in some ways determine the kind of the change. I suppose there are going to be moments though within that where for example, you are faced with what you can do within a particular context. So, for example, if we are talking about just implementing kind of political changes, there are certain things that are going to work because you're just constrained materially, but you can make choices within that to try and apply this particular approach to that rather than another one. So one of the things I quite liked was actually I quite like Eric Olin Wright in his Imagining Real Utopias
Mm-hmm.
has this really interesting thing about you can't in different contexts different political models or particular utopias uh, might work. So one context it might work and one context it wouldn't. But having this kind of an understanding of both of different models that you could apply and some of the flaws of those models enables you to then think, well, which ones are we going to apply in this context and which would have a certain useful function. So I suppose that is in one way in which I would see culture, a broader sort of a set of ideas as being useful. I quite like Bogdanov, so I constantly try and sort of explore some of his kind of work about. So there's a certain sense in his work, there is this idea that you sort of that culture is kind of important in guiding the revolution. So for him, there's something like people like Diderot were kind of important in setting up sort of ideas which then could be taken up and sort of help direct the French Revolution in the right kind of direction. And so there's a certain his attempt to kind of build a kind of proletarian culture is an attempt to enable the workers to kind of help envision the kind of communism that you would want to sort of envision, or the process of moving towards communism.
Right.
So I think there should be an interplay at some level between culture and sort of material conditions.
The Bogdanov version of pro cult is very much pushing beyond the proletarian as it currently is and having it push itself into something completely new. And you sort of miss, I mean, I do think there is sort of an aesthetic tragedy to when the Soviet Union totally gives up on futurism and goes, total social realist, and it becomes very hard to distinguish between socialist, realist, and fascist art, for example.
Yeah, it does. And also, there's also parallels between like Hollywood sort of moving into this kind of natural sort of method acting, and then sort of Stanislavski, and I mean, it's almost like at that period, a lot of the art sort of starts to become very similar in some sort of respect.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose like when one does aesthetic criticism, Adorno makes a lot more sense. Of us, but in the sense that like you do see the various systems start producing the same kinds of art, the same kinds of like highly exaggerated naturalism based on classical proportions, the same kinds of valorization. And I wouldn't go so far as Adorno does, as to basically imply that everything that everyone does all the time is fascist. But I do think there's that period. If you look at the art, you kind of get you do feel in all the cultures actually. I mean, because you look at like American silent cinema and 20s and 30s art, pre-code art, pre-code pop art, pop cinema and whatnot, is way wilder and more interesting than, and unfortunately a lot of it's lost, than war period art going forward into the 50s. And you're right, there, like, you can find parallels not just between fascist art and Soviet art where it's obvious, but you can find parallels between Soviet art and capitalist art. And it's actually used to frustrate and fascinate me, this weird time period between the 50s and the 70s where like the Soviet Union's and it's particularly the Soviet Union's, actually isn't as true in China. The Soviet Union's producing like TV shows that are clearly just Sovietified versions of Western TV shows, and it's very odd. It's just like, well, why would you even do that? Like, what's the purpose of that? And so, yeah, I get that there was something to this period of mass culture, and one thing about avant-garde art that makes it both kind of elitist, if we're honest, but also cut against that trend, is that it resists standardization, standard interpretation, and even in some ways, in the case of like plastic arts, it resists mass production. Like, it's hard to mass produce a lot of avant-garde multimedia art. It's really hard to do.
Yeah, I think one of the other things that I find really, I mean, I suppose there's the one side of avant-garde art which is quite elitist, and I mean maybe it always has that, but it also has these kind of attempts to try and be participatory at some level. There's like obviously, I mean, how much you want to see prolet cult as a avant-garde movement, because I know there's a kind of tension within the prolet cult movement as a whole about whether it's avant-garde. I know like people like Eisenstein did work within the prolet cult, but but there is also, I think Bogdanov had a much more cynical, was much more critical of avant-garde art as such, or as it was materializing. But everything from like things like from sort of prolet cult right through to, I don't know, Fluxus, there's an attempt to try and explore what participation might mean. So I suppose there's an interesting kind of there's an interesting tension, I guess, between this idea of avant-garde art as a kind of elitist project and avant-garde art as a kind of participatory, or even maybe a revolutionary kind of project, which kind of brings people in.
I think that the tension is in its very active production, though, and I think like we could almost literally, I hate using this word because it's been so ruined by lazy Marxists, but it really is dialectical in the sense that like the participatory experience, right, can pull anyone in and it really can be open to all classes around, but it's also limited and exclusive to that particular moment. And so that also makes it something that becomes highly exclusive. And so that tension is there, and different kinds of artists have leaned into that different ways. Some try to push the participatory expansion out. Others have really doubled down on the, this is an authentic experience. And when you focus on that, it does tend to turn like elitist, because who has access to the moment of authenticity. And I don't see a way around that tension, actually, is like in our current society, how you could, go about that. But I do think of like the guerrilla art movement of like the 90s and the aughts here in the States, which was very much like, well, this can happen anywhere to anybody, and we're not, it is exclusive in the fact that it's authentic, and like you don't know when it's going to happen. But it's also, it deliberately tried to do it in places where everybody could could have access to it in the moment that it happened. So it wasn't exclusive in the other sense where, it's only happening in downtown Manhattan and, or Las Vegas or whatever. I find that fascinating, but I also found the internet kind of killed that because flash mobs became a thing and internet flash mobs sort of dissolved that tension. But in a way that's a third thing, because experience guerrilla art as a flash mob on the internet is not actually experiencing that event. Like it's experiencing a recording of that event. It's like watching a play versus going to a play.
Yeah, and I mean, well, participation in and of itself isn't necessarily a positive thing. It's not necessarily a revolutionary or radical thing. So, but I think you probably do need it at some level to create a kind of a radical democracy of some kind. But it doesn't human resources uses certain forms of participation, and there's certain forms of participation on the internet, for example, which are just not liberatory at all.
Social media.
So I suppose, yeah, exactly. So just because people are participating, that in of itself doesn't mean that it's a good thing.
Okay. Yeah, I definitely see that. I'm thinking about like the like I think as an artist, what's interesting about that is that would be impossible to control. Like in some ways, like you could set it up to be more elitist or less elitist, but how it ultimately plays out and how it ultimately, like, what's the nature of the participation, whether it's good or bad. It is kind of like a spontaneous political movement or a riot or something in that sense, where the outcome may not actually be good, and there's no way to determine it in the moment of spontaneous action, right? Like,
yeah, I mean, I suppose that the only extent to which you can is to work out how it's framed. Like, if you're going to create something that's sort of spontaneous or has some sort of form of participation in it, you can frame it in a particular way, which means that it kind of is more likely to produce one type of thing rather than another type of thing. Because it's not like, unless you're just trying to imagine, because you're not imagining participation in a vacuum. There's a certain context in which it's emerging, which pulls it in a particular direction. So if we're thinking about, well, I mean, participation in a human resources context is going to largely be one that's going to have that the company, the framework of the company in mind. It's going to be largely in favor of the bosses, or so you might be. There's a bit in Boltanski and Chiapello's The New Spirit of Capitalism, where they talk about how participation is used in order for workers to kind of monitor each other, whether they're taking maybe too much sick time off, or so rather than the boss telling people not to take sick time, the pressure comes from other workers, and there's a kind of participation there. You could kind of see that as kind of workers' non-hierarchical, sort of almost horizontal kind of setup, but at the same time, it's actually not really the kind of liberatory, emancipatory model or thing that we would actually necessarily want, or thing that we would want.
So we've been talking for about an hour, and I want to give you a nice out. I want to thank you for your time, but I do want you to share some things from your site and from your, from the art you've been perusing lately that you particularly enjoy, that you think may not be obvious to my listeners and viewers to go find.
So in terms of my site, we've got, so there's a number of things. So there's the podcast, the podcast is a sort of development. So what I usually do is I organize a sort of session so people can join the sessions. At the moment they're on hiatus, but generally what would happen is we have like online, usually interviews. So I would interview somebody, but the idea is that people can kind of ask questions throughout, and it's a moment where people can come together and chat about particular themes. And then usually that gets turned into a podcast. So they're on YouTube under Exploding Appendix, and they're also on SoundCloud at the moment. Hopefully we'll get some other places to put the podcasts. but yeah, they're online, and the Cake Tasting Society will be coming out soon. But at the moment, I'm going to try and enter it into some, or put it into some festivals and do things like that. But yeah, there should be sort of more artistic projects going up on Exploding Appendix in the future. We did do, the other thing I'm sort of gradually working on is the dossier series, which is that out of these kind of meetups, we've run a kind of an online journal. So each dossier is sort of developing a certain sort of set of ideas and pieces of writing, although we try and make it quite multimedia in some respects, exploring one element of how we want to think about the avant-garde in a very broad sense. So those are the kind of projects that are sort of emerging on our website. And I think there are, there's a range of different either engagements with a sort of artists or creatives that I kind of found really interesting, as well as sort of engagements with sort of people that I think are doing interesting thought or sort of ideas-based stuff. So I suppose in that respect, I think a lot of the stuff on there is about, I suppose my most political stuff is probably some of those sessions and podcasts, because I'm sort of engaging with ideas more directly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And as far as outside of your own work, what would you tell people to peruse right now?
Let me think. I've been reading quite a range of different stuff lately. I suppose, I mean, I'm very much excited by a lot of some of the stuff that you guys are actually doing, and I really liked some of the stuff that you'll be doing with Shalon on Christopher Lash. Actually, there was a podcast you did.
Yeah, there's a couple actually on the back end of this blog too. There's an additional one where we're going through the literature in time periods. So yeah.
No, I think that's really interesting. I mean, I've done some interviews on, like, we did one on a body in Fukushima, which is quite an interesting art book on dance photography. So that was a really, I suppose it's something that I'm not usually doing, but I am interested in sort of dance as well, as something that I can come back to from a more practical point of view.
Okay.
I suppose I suppose we interviewed Gross Scorzo about his post-Socratic dialogues. I quite like the idea of using dialogues in this. I mean, in a similar way that fragments seem sort of to make sense today, I think thinking through dialogue is sort of an interesting way of approaching thinking about politics, partly because you don't necessarily have to, you can talk to a range of different people without actually having to take a side, but you can sort of expose them to different arguments. I think there are I don't know. There's I mean, I always like sort of watching, I don't know. I really like things like watching Twin Peaks and things like that. I really enjoyed the I know this is about 2017, so it's going back a bit, but is it 2017? Was it 2018 maybe? That came out.
I think it was a little. I think it feels like the end of the 2017, and then
it was 2017. It was actually. I remember it coming up when because officially Exploding Appendix launched in 2017, so I kind of remember that being I mean, that's more. I was really inspired by that in just the way it explored the structuring of. So that's me in my more surrealist moment, liking the kind of the way it sort of structured the narrative and kept you like waiting for like ages for certain things to sort of materialize. Yeah.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank you for your time. People can find your site in the show notes when I release this. And thank you
so
very
it's
much.
Exploding Appendix at explodingappendix.com, which is quite simple.
Yeah, explodingappendix.com. All right.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for doing this. It's been lovely to
thank
talk
you.
to you.
Yeah, I've been actually been wanting to interview you back since that profile. Like, when did I do that profile for you? It must have been.
I think that was 2018.
Yeah, 2018. I was like, I was in America, so it was after 2017. But like, yeah. So yeah. All right. Thank you very much. All right.
Yeah, thank you.